Okay, no, that's a terrific idea. I love it. I love it.
Actually, have you ever taken the Myers-Briggs personality test?
Oh yes, absolutely. I'm an ENFP.
Oh, that's a fun personality type.
Yeah, right.
The internet is the best thing that was ever invented.
Well, yes, there's a lot of good things about it. I agree.
That's a very millennial mindset of me.
That's right. That's right. And I'm not so millennial, so.
Welcome to the Epic Voices and Conversations podcast, giving you, the listener, the opportunity to experience, engage, explore, and sometimes share stories of energy, passion, inspiration, and connectedness. We are your hosts, Raquel Buchanan
and Dave Matthews. Our real jobs between doing these podcasts are being mental health providers, therapists, and group facilitators, working with people whose issues are related to high stress, trauma, violent behavior, and intimate partner or family violence.
As a part of providing trauma-informed care, we intend for these podcasts to inspire professionals working with children, youth, and adults who have experienced trauma or violence some hope and support to build self-awareness, increase professional self-care strategies, and to help in developing resilience while doing the work in the field.
The Epic Voices and Conversations podcast is brought to you by 1T Productions.
Are you ready for some interesting conversations, stimulating considerations, and hearing passionate voices? Episode 1, The Epic Interview with the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. For this podcast episode, we are teaming up with the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma to give you the inside scoop on the 25th Annual IVAT Summit. We recently had the opportunity to sit down and talk with Dr. Bob Geffner, the founder and longtime leader of the IVAT Summit, and Sandi Capuano Morrison, who is the current executive director. I learned quite a bit from them both about the summit's beginnings and overall background, and I have to say I'm quite impressed as to how accessible they are for being such important people.
Yes, they are. And over the past 19 out of 25 summits that I've attended, I have certainly learned a lot. What are a few of these highlights?
For me, something that was particularly interesting was hearing more about some of the challenges they've encountered over the past 25 years and how they overcame them.
That's right, Raquel. IVAT has certainly had their share of challenges and even have experienced challenges in putting together this 25th annual summit. Due to what is going on around us, the global pandemic, IVAT has had to work this challenge, ultimately deciding to move their summit online.
This really is an epic moment. For the first time ever in 25 years, the annual San Diego Summit has gone virtual. What I'm excited to share is this new experience and what to look forward to in this year's summit. Let's take a listen to our conversation. Good morning, Sandi.
Hey, Sandi.
Good morning. How are you both?
Good.
Doing
Very
well.
nice to see your faces.
Likewise. So, I got to ask Sandi, what's the thinking in terms of dealing with the conference? And
Today, looking at how many speakers have agreed to still provide their training through Zoom, actually.
yeah,
So it looks like we have maybe not quite half of the program confirmed. So we're going to offer a condensed program option to the attendees that are able to participate that way. And I'm
very good.
super excited that so many of our speakers were willing to offer that. Now it's
Wow.
really the issue of how do we figure out with everybody in different time zones?
Right?
How we coordinate that, right? Especially like East Coast to Hawaii.
Hey there, Bob.
Hi there.
Oh, good. We got good audio.
Well, I can change that.
How you doing, Bob?
Well, you mean given that we're stuck in our home for, the rest of our lives, or next month, whichever comes first?
Whichever comes first, I know. Oh, and so Sandi filled us in a little bit, Bob, about what's happening there and how you guys are going to be accommodating people even from a distance.
We're trying to, yeah. Well, we're blaming Raquel for everything.
Oh, well, that's a good idea. I think that's a good place to go. So there are three parts to what we want to kind of focus on today. One part has to do with kind of the experiences that the two of you have had with IVAT in terms of the challenges and the ways in which you kind of work through some of those challenges. And, I would encourage you to also talk about ways you've navigated through those parts as well as overcome them in the past.
You expect me to remember those things that happened, more than a day ago?
Well, I think your memory is pretty good, Bob. I know your memory is pretty good. And then the second part of what I want us to kind of move through, and that Raquel and I will kind of shepherd us into, is I'd like to get a little more personal with you in terms of your own experiences and your own kind of ways in which you kind of keep yourself going. What keeps the gas going through you and keeps you energized and keeps you kind of moving through things. And then the third section is really more specific to the overall format, this epic moments thing, which has to do with providing people that are listening kind of format in which they can kind of draw from within, but they're hearing your parts in terms of what brings you energy, what kinds of passions do you have. All right, how are we doing, Raquel? Are we about ready?
Join us after the break for more from Bob Geffner and Sandi Capuano Morrison of the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. If you want your agency, company, or group to have a presence on this podcast, or you'd like to advertise for an event or show your support, please contact us for rates and formatting of your announcement. We can be reached directly at evacpodcast@gmail.com.
How are we doing, Raquel? Are we about ready?
We are ready.
All right.
We talked a little bit how mass illness is really impacting the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma and the whole summit. So this is one of the challenges that we've discussed, and how you're using technology to be able to continue to spread training and awareness of violence and abuse, which is great. We'd be interested in hearing some other challenges that maybe you've encountered over the last 35 years.
Well, the first challenge that comes to my mind is 9/11. We were in the middle of our large summit when 9/11 hit. And so by the time we got to our opening even, we still had 1,300 people there and had to deal with that on the spot with all those people. A lot of panic, all the people who worked at and staffed at the hotel. We had no real information. In some respects, that was one of the turning points, I think, for the Institute. At that time, we were the Family Violence and Sexual Assault Institute, which is our incorporated nonprofit name that I started 35 years ago. From that standpoint, we had to actually practice what we were preaching with all these people, how to take care of each other in collaborative, cooperative ways to make sure nobody was being scapegoated, and how we dealt with emergencies. I mean, we had people there from different religious and spiritual orientations. Interesting, among other things, is, I don't think anybody who was there that day will forget being there that day. And I think how we dealt with it became sort of a model that others started using in dealing with emergency situations like this. There were many profound moments during that. The people decided to continue the conference in a modified way for the next 3 days. So we actually dealt with some of these. Some of the sessions ended up switching to deal with events like this, where you're talking about violence at the extreme level and prejudice at the extreme level, because everyone was erupting against people in the Middle East or people from Islamic backgrounds. And those things became highlighted around the country and the world. The other thing is that we had lots of military there at the summit. And the wife of the highest ranking military officer killed in 9/11 was there. And to give you just a real quick flavor, remember, we had different planes coming in at different times into the buildings. Obviously, military people who had family in Washington, D.C., in New York, who were trying to get a hold of their families. And the particular woman who was a social worker, whose husband was in D.C., who had retired, a general, she got a hold of him, and he said everything was fine, which, because she was really quite depressed, and then ended up feeling much better, and we had people with her, and then couldn't get a hold of him again. And it turned out when the later plane crashed into the Pentagon, he was killed there. He was there voluntarily. He had retired. And, the military flew her back immediately. I think the good part was how we came together and how people really united, which is exactly what you'd want. The bad news is it completely changed our country. I mean, it put trauma on the forefront. It changed priorities. And for the Institute, it became a major problem financially, because after that, all of the state and federal funding just stopped. It took us years to recover from that, because we had quite a bit of funding at that time and a very large attendance at the summit. Yeah, so that was one of the, I think, major momentous things more in this century.
I remember getting woken up by a call from my wife saying, you got to turn on the TV. I turned it on, and there it was, the second plane coming into the World Trade Center. And from that point on, I mean, I went outside to look to see what was going on, and it was just a ghost town. Finally, when I did make it into the conference area, yes, we had the screens up and we were watching for a while. And then I remember there was a decision, I would guess you made, or the group made, in terms of saying, you know what, we'll have the TVs in a particular place, and if people want to have that kind of contact, they can have, but we're not going to continue to show it up on the big screens.
I mean, we dealt with PTSD, on the site. And what we realized then is every time people saw that, because they were replaying that like every, few minutes, and we realized everybody was getting re-traumatized and being triggered by seeing it all over again. And that's when we decided to cut out the big screens and that, and we set up specifically a TV in a separate room with one person monitoring it. So if there's any real news, that we would be able to share it with everybody, so that nobody would be left out of what was going on. And then we had to deal with all the different issues, those who wanted to have some type of religious get together, and we had people who had that different faiths go into separate areas. We had a lot of leaders, we had ministers and others. Then we had people who had medical, so the physicians who were there, would then start working to make sure people had medications, what we needed to do from a medical standpoint. And then we put an emergency crisis team essentially into place on the spot to do counseling and help people through either as small groups or individually. Anywhere in the hotel, we set up some emergency rooms there. It was, this was not pre-planned, obviously. We saw trauma firsthand at a large scale.
So, Bob, I can imagine that after Summit was over and you collected all your people together, how did that go?
Well, one of the things is there was probably about near 20 speakers who were stuck there. So we actually had to house some of them in the hotel. Some we actually had in our houses. So we had people there who would let people stay. So we didn't have our normal, quote, debriefing afterwards. It took a while. And there was people who literally, speakers and others, who could not come back to the summit for a while because just being at that hotel and in the summit. I think when we did have some debriefing and talk to people, people were quite affected and felt that in some respects they were glad they were at this spot as opposed to maybe others because of the way we handled it and because of the issues. But it broadened our summit. We we actually start moving into broader areas of trauma after that,
Right.
because up to that point, we were focusing much more on family violence issues.
That's right. Yep.
And so then it became more clear over the next few years. And in fact, that's when we developed IVAT. So there, a lot of things were changed after that.
So would you say, Bob, that certainly all the effects of everything that happened were pretty much continuous?
Yeah. And I mean, around 2004, when we had lost probably about 50% of our funding from all these sources, and our attendance had dropped quite a bit, is when we started realizing that we might not be sustainable. That is when essentially the Family Violence and Sexual Assault Institute, which was a nonprofit community-based corporation institute center, merged with Alliant International University.
Wow.
And that's when IVAT was formed as an educational-based, university-based nonprofit entity. And so when IVAT developed, which would be 2006, we added a component that we had not had before. We added direct services, and we started actually doing direct services, and that was still before Sandi joined. And we started training doctorate students and others in order to be able to provide some direct services. And we were dealing with forensic cases nationally. That was another, turning point, but we were still suffering from the after effects and the financial, trying to stabilize, trying to get to the next dimension, really building. And Sandi is actually the longest term employee that IVAT has had.
Yay.
I mean, we had different records of 3 years, 4 years, and then, she keeps passing those, obviously.
Yeah.
And Sandi wasn't hired as the executive director. Sandi actually was hired as a program coordinator and was in charge of the summit, and then continued to move up, until becoming the CEO. Had numerous transitions over time. IVAT then became our official name. We separated completely from the university in 2016, and have continued. And shortly after that is when we opened our Hawaii branch.
So would it be fair to say that in terms of the way in which you did a lot of evolving over the years, had to do a lot with just what was going on externally, and then you had to kind of make some shifts and do some changes internally?
Yeah, I would say one of the reasons we've been reasonably successful is, I think throughout the 30 plus years, we've basically been ahead of the curve, where we were doing things and anticipating things before they had necessarily occurred. During the years, as we continued to branch out into a one-stop shop, often we were ahead of the curve. And I think that's what's helped us. And the idea of trauma being the base, when we changed our name to that institute and our conference started doing that, there were only a couple of other conferences around that were as focused on trauma itself as a basis for all these issues.
When you came on, Sandi, what were some of the challenges that you seemed to face? It sounds like you started out by kind of overseeing the summit itself.
Yeah, I think initially it was a challenge of, as the summit grew, as the program grew, looking at the best way to continue to provide so many different tracks and topics and focus areas. We hear a lot that with the 12 tracks and things happening simultaneously, to be able to cover issues across the lifespan, we always hear, people saying, I don't know what to choose from. I don't know which session to go to. And so I think, there's often been requests for, why aren't you having sessions repeated throughout the day? So I think a lot of it is really looking at, as our comprehensiveness of the topics we covered expands, and as we have more and more people from different disciplines participating, how do we make sure that we're providing the content needed for other target areas? So for example, we're trying to do more focused on what educators specifically need, especially given much more focus and attention, thankfully, in the past few years to what, trauma-informed care and systemic work looks like. We've also been trying to expand to having more law enforcement involved. Challenges related to having law enforcement or medical professionals involved, related to the types of continuing education accreditations needed for those groups.
Right.
I think some of it, and what I've always is a blessing and a curse with how big IVAT's mission is, it's just how much we are trying to help people connect those dots.
Absolutely.
And see that it's not just one type of violence, but people are often experiencing multiple forms of violence or multiple forms of oppression.
Right.
And how that compounds the trauma. So as Bob said, I think with the help of our planning committee and our incredible network of speakers and collaborators such as yourselves, we've been able to really try to keep ahead of what else do we see different disciplines needing more information and training and priority areas to focus on.
Nice.
So constantly evolving.
I know it's got to happen, where somebody submits a request to present, but there's some controversy perhaps about either that person or about that point of view that is being suggested to be a part of the summit, right? Specifically, that there was some discussion about how do we do this?
Yeah, we've had a history going back a long time for dealing with what others have necessarily called controversial topics or issues.
Right.
We've never shied away as long as people would be willing to talk and be able to have a conversation and dialogue as opposed to a fanatic argument that we would not agree with. I think that goes along in some respects to the philosophy that we've operated. We are unique from a summit standpoint or an institute standpoint in that we're interdisciplinary. We are definitely multicultural in staff and in what we do, but we're also a hybrid. And by a hybrid, I mean we have researchers, practitioners, advocates, policymakers, all working together. And the summit brings them all together. So we're not a research conference. We're not a practitioner conference. We're all. And so our presentations can go from, 20 minutes, 30 minutes for research to 3 hours for an in-depth workshop.
Right.
So dealing with controversial topics was something that I said we were on the forefront. When we dealt with them, they were very controversial, like dealing with male victims, like dealing with female offenders, like dealing with an emphasis on trauma, which, we did all these things. And looking at the difference between aggression and abuse, and how to define things. So when we had people speaking on these topics in the early days, there were people who were quite upset. When we developed a program as an alternate for dealing with couples where they had been domestic violence, the philosophy was you'd never do that. And that you can't do it.
Right.
And yet we developed and others developed programs that were very successful with very specific criteria and assessments. But there are people for 30 years who wouldn't talk to me or deal with us because we had been working with shelter programs and others to deal with these areas in order to look at what the science said. So we were very science-based, theoretical-based when we did things. We didn't do things, wildly or for no reason. When the research said this was a good idea, we would tend to follow it or modify it or work with it. And others weren't necessarily on board with that. So we did have several times during our history controversial speakers and topics. And most often they were rated good, even though they were dealing with topics that people weren't too happy to hear about. But we occasionally did have a speaker who took a more fanatic position that we didn't necessarily identify ahead of time. And so the planning committee would then decide afterwards that, that would not be productive.
Right.
The person wasn't interested in a dialogue, wasn't interested in really looking at the issues, and they didn't really have a science base behind them. They would just be essentially their own agenda.
Right.
So there were times when speakers or topics, mostly speakers, I don't think too many topics were rejected. But we've had that happen at times prior to Sandi being there and after Sandi has been there.
Yeah.
That's why we have planning committees, national planning committees for everything we do.
Right.
Everything we've done is collaborative and inclusive. If you're interested in our agenda and you want to work at trying to achieve it, then you're welcome. I think one of the more controversial topics we've dealt with in our summit itself is the power and control issues within the family violence, domestic violence, child abuse movements.
Right. Yeah.
And in fact, we've done that from time to time because the way we treat each other sometimes, and we see that happening today in our society, we are more divided in our society today than even when I started this institute during the civil rights time or Vietnam or way back then.
Yeah.
And that has been counter to what we've essentially preached and practiced is we really need to work together. And so if you're interested in that, then you're welcome.
Sandi, do you remember any particular time since you've been on board in terms of trying to deal with some of these particular issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it might have been 5 years ago now. We had some concern raised about, some particular speakers. And we actually had our planning committee form a subcommittee to create guiding principles.
Oh, yeah.
That could help really share the message and help people understand that it wasn't just Bob saying, yes, this person will speak at the summit or not. That there was a lot of peer review taking place and a lot of principles that were based on, looking at research and looking at ethical and, decision making and integrity of what content we were pushing out, and asking people to really be mindful of being open to other thoughts and opinions and perspectives, because that is the core of what we're doing. That, that supports the mission and the goal of the work in general, to be helping make everyone stronger and better together, rather than saying, I don't agree with you, so you shouldn't be allowed to have a voice at this event. So that's actually a document that we created that's in all of our conference or summit programs now, to really help people see that it doesn't help to shut voices down. We need to have more opportunities to give people chances to respectfully talk through those differences of opinion and challenge the methodology or the research or what, where people are coming from and stating what they're presenting on. So, and I think that helped a lot. I think that really helped both emphasize that it's not about cherry picking certain people, and that the expectation was that people were being respectful in communication and behavior, and also to really underscore that we're grateful for the multidisciplinary network that has always been part of both recommending people to participate in the summit, as well as helping review those submissions that come in.
Absolutely.
So I think that was a really key piece of being able to explain our process and to emphasize that we support voices and differing opinions.
Beautiful. So I imagine that, well, hopefully there's, with all these 25 years of the work that you've done, all the challenges that you've had over the past 25 years, and now we're here kind of faced with some further challenges, deciding whether to meet or not, or what's going to happen. Are there alternative ways and alternative methods? So as we talked about earlier, probably, you've already said that there are some alternatives that you're choosing to look at in terms of dealing and meeting the challenge of what's happening currently with our having to deal with the pandemic and such.
What's interesting is when all this started happening a few weeks ago, I mean, we had already had over 750 people already registered for the summit. And what was interesting to me is it was clear, within a week or so ago that things had to change. And once they locked down everything, we really anticipated that people were going to start canceling left and right. And some obviously had to because their states or their universities or their agencies would no longer allow them to travel. So speakers, we had some cancellations. But to me, what was interesting is we still have over 700 people who want something. In other words, they didn't all cancel once they heard they couldn't come. So some respects we have to adapt. And that's what Sandi's been working on now for this year.
How do you keep tenacity when all of these things happen?
On a very personal level now. So we're asking about your own kind of way in which you, is there a story or is there a particular piece that motivates you to do what you do?
Well, let Sandi go first since I've been talking a lot, and then I can give you some of my perspectives.
So related to the interpersonal violence piece of it, when I first think of that question, what comes to mind immediately is when I used to do rape crisis advocacy, and how impactful and how profoundly I remember the first time I showed up as a rape crisis advocate to be with someone who had just reported a sexual assault, and having a perfect stranger, myself, come often in the middle of the night to be there with them, to hold that space for them, to help share their rights, help them navigate through all of the very, very confusing and terrifying and traumatic procedures and thoughts that were happening at that time, and how important it was that somebody was receptive to having me as a stranger be there with them in that moment.
Yeah.
And for them to literally say, I can't believe you came, and being so grateful for someone recognizing how important it is to have that support. And I guess what helps me continue to do it is not only how much that impacted me, but to see how many people drop everything and run towards, whether it's first responders running towards the danger, or just people being able to put their own needs aside and be able to say, I am here and I'm ready to help in whatever way you help me understand can be most beneficial for you.
And so just as even you talking about that, I can feel that kind of sense of connection that you feel.
Absolutely.
And
so that's what generates continued energy in me to, not be one to be more comfortable standing on the sidelines, but someone who I'm energized by jumping in and doing what I can, because I appreciate that it's an area a lot of people aren't able to, work in and able to handle. And I fully respect that. And when I do trainings for others that are learning how to be domestic violence and rape crisis advocates, I thank them, because you can choose to do any number of things, right? And all of those ways of either professionally or in volunteer capacities, offering your help are important. But it takes a lot emotionally, spiritually, physically, to do this work. So advocacy I think advocacy and grassroots work is what makes this world go round.
Nice. How about you, Bob? What kind of comes to you as far as a significant experience or something that kind of grabs you in terms of keeps you doing the work?
Hard to say, because I don't fit a lot of stereotypes of, things that happened to me personally or reasons. I've always essentially been against oppression, whether it's prejudice against individuals.
Yeah.
In other words, I've always been for what I would call the underdog, and fighting for the people who needed help. Whether it was in private practice, working with clients, which I did for many years and still do in part, or training people. But I think for me, looking at the big picture and realizing that when we work on a one-to-one basis, you can help that one person. And that's, as Sandi just gave a great example of, very gratifying to be able to see people change, to see people overcome their fears, their traumas, to heal and to become empowered, whether it's a domestic violence victim or a traumatized child. That is part of it. But I think the other part is the bigger picture of realizing we need to change and move forward as a community, as a society, as a world.
Yeah.
And the ways people treat other people based on prejudice, on stereotypes, is so dangerous. And so, in part, that's how this institute got started, is to not only deal with on the individual level, but to start looking at systems changes. People ask me quite often, like I've been doing this work now for over 40 years. And the Institute is celebrating its 35th anniversary. And people said, well, how come you don't burn out? I really can't answer that because I think for me and the way I function, being able to see the big picture, to be able to see steps toward that really continues the energy. And doing lots of different things. I learned a long time ago, for me personally, I could not do one thing. I could not be a therapist full time. I could not be just an academic faculty member full time. I mean, I was, and that's how I learned. And because I do so many different things, even with the Institute now, my day could be broken into 10 different sub-days, sub-parts that are all completely different. That, I think, helps to keep me going. Being able to interact with people, staff now, because my role is different as the president, but being able to see people like Sandi and others and seeing all of them become professionals and really good people in their own right, that helps continue the energy.
And for me, I really relate very closely with that area that you talked about, having multiple roles, multiple things that are happening. It's not, and I don't mean to minimize it, but it's not just the direct service. It's the opportunity to share with others. It's the opportunity to be involved in the systems change stuff. All those pieces, I really agree with you that are really integral for me to somehow nurture those pieces as a way to continue on in doing that work. So here's my last question for the two of you. Of the summit presenters, of the summit, those that over the years that you've been there, which one, if you can pick one, really felt was most meaningful for you in terms of
outside David Matthews, you mean?
Yeah, outside of me, of course. Of course.
For me personally, I can't pick one. There have been about 3 or 4 who have been there the whole time. Alan Rosenbaum, for example.
Right. Absolutely.
He was one of the originals. In fact, was probably the main person who's still doing the work. That was there back in the 80s when I didn't know who he was, but who I met. There was about 5 of us that really, when I was fighting other people who said you couldn't do this or that, who then actually supported the idea of starting this institute because there was nothing like it. And he's been there ever since, and he's been to almost all the summits. And then the second group were people like Kevin Hamburger, Jackie Campbell, and Oliver Williams. Back then, he was a graduate student. And see, I've known a lot of these people who are now professors and others who I knew as graduate students in building the network. But they've been involved for a long time and have been to all these, despite all of us getting older. And they come and, they volunteer their time, just like you did. And by the way, those people were pressured not to come. I mean,
Yeah.
there were times back at the beginning of the century when we were dealing with these controversies that we've talked about, where there was organized efforts to shut me out and to close down the summit, literally. And it was people like that who came despite pressures and threats. I mean, I've been threatened. They were too. Some of them were threatened that they'd lose their funding if they came, or more other things.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of respect for people, and the people I mentioned all come from different fields.
Absolutely.
I mean, you have a psychologist, you have a nurse, you have a social worker.
Yep.
I mean, I most of the time can't even remember what professions people are, because that's not important to me. Those people come to mind because they've been there from the beginning.
Nice. Yeah.
And have supported through tense times. They were all there at 9/11, and they're still coming despite my best efforts.
That's right. And so I'll give you a minute to, while Sandi responds, but also to come back to any speakers that stand out for you too. Okay, we'll come back to you on that one, Bob.
Well, yeah, okay. I was just going to mention one other who stand out, and then Sandi too, because we talked a lot about 9/11, and a person I met after that was Azim Khamisa, who's local, who is Islamic, and who started a foundation because his son was killed.
His son was killed. He was a pizza delivery boy, wasn't he, or something?
Yes, exactly. And at a very young age. I mean, he's a college student with a huge future.
Yeah.
And he started the whole thing on forgiveness. What was very important was 2002, the year after 9/11, for our summit. And how are we going to bring the country together? How are we going to bring people together? And so he was intentionally made our opening speaker.
Wow.
And he's been involved ever since.
Yeah.
But that stood out because of his message at the time, which was really profound. To dealing with, 1,800 people at the time. And so I just wanted to mention that because that was a different type of moment.
I remember him. I remember him speaking, him talking about how he started the organization with the killer.
Yes.
The guy who went to prison, and he ended up visiting him, and then they started the nonprofit.
Yes.
Amazing, amazing forgiveness story. Absolutely. Sandi?
Again, it's hard to choose because we've had so many courageous people talk about personal experiences and loss that have been inspirational. And one that comes to mind because it impacted me as a parent is Nicole Hockley, whose son Dylan was murdered in the Sandy Hook shootings in Newtown, Connecticut. And she was one of our plenary speakers, gosh, maybe 6-7 years ago now. It was one of those moments where seeing that very visceral pain that she had as she was presenting, and moving through that pain to help try to generate more action around the problems that we have related to gun violence in this country. And talking about it in a different way than we talked about before, because we hadn't seen the massacre of children in an elementary school yet, right? We've had lots and lots of lives lost due to the number of guns and all of the many considerations. But I remember I had to get back up on stage and thank Nicole after she so gracefully spoke about how she was moving that pain into activism. And it was really difficult to do because it hit me right in the heart. And it brought me right back to that moment when that massacre was happening, and my child was 3 at the time in her daycare center. But it also in that same moment also really kind of brought me to a place of how do we help people not shut down from fear, and being able to find ways of sharing that power and that message through that pain, as other ways to connect people and to not have this fear of isolate or, the other is always the
Yep.
person committing the harm.
Yep.
So I think Nicole was so graceful, and we've had, unfortunately, many speakers that have been in that situation, Azim, as we just mentioned, or
Yep.
Aaron Runyon, whose daughter was murdered, but being able to use that trauma
Right.
as a way to try to help others open up and try to do more rather than withdraw and
Right.
separate.
Right.
It's interesting because each year those presentations are so powerful, and people keep asking, well, how are you going to top that next year?
Right.
Which is getting to be a lot of pressure. But I mean, when you look at the people who have been involved, and we're going to try to bring quite a few of these people back this year to celebrate the anniversaries over these years.
Yeah.
But how they've been able to become empowered and how they use their history to help others
Right.
is very profound and emotionally powerful.
Stay tuned for the Epic Moments interview with Bob Geffner and Sandi Capuano Morrison of the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma.
My name is Tara Schmidt. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist with the Center for Counseling and Education.
Hi there. I am Caroline Redmond. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in Palm Springs, California.
Ari Rieger, MFT.
We are the Center for Counseling and Education, facilitating the link between mental health and education. We offer counseling and therapy services to individuals, children, and families who live in the Coachella Valley. To schedule an appointment, please give our office a call at 760-880-4334.
And we're going to segue now, and right, Raquel?
Yes, we are ready to do an Epic Moments interview.
When people share their trauma with you, it becomes your trauma. When people share their triumph with you, it becomes your triumph. And so I think it's something that we need to kind of hold on to and use. And that's why this podcast started. So the whole idea behind Epic Moments is about us being able to pay attention to these things that we can bring them back to mind, things that bring you energy, things that you're passionate about. But what we know, of course, is that when we make these have these thoughts in our mind, when we bring them forward, what we know, and it's a very physiological response that we have in terms of when we make these connections in our mind, that the oxytocin is released, and then we have this sense of calm and peace. And so this is a practice, this is a process in which I think that I found to be helpful for me personally, as a professional in the field, but also with a lot of the clients that I've worked with them through this process as well. So just kind of briefly, you don't have to kind of talk about it at length at all, but if you could mention one or two pieces of energy, pieces of things that you're passionate about, any other inspirational people in your life or things that you look towards, and connections, any specific people or situations that you feel that have brought on some sense of compassion.
Well, for me, like role models, I guess, in some respects, my grandfather, who died very young, was probably my first role model. And then Ted Sarbin at that stage of my development was another. And then later on, my father.
Wow.
So I've had different people at different times. And I mentioned, Robert Kennedy, too, because of the social justice issues. And I've had clients over the years in private practice where, I watched them essentially become empowered. All those different events continue the energy. And again, remember, I grew up and I was there during the civil rights things. I was there during Vietnam War issues. So a lot of things that were evolving at the time, I think, helped structure where I ended up.
Sandi?
For me, I think gratitude and really taking those moments to be grateful, especially when you see how the courage and how much so many people are dealing with and living through. So I am grateful to have a incredibly loving family. I lost my mother in high school. And so when we talk about resilience, kind of some of that early learning how to get through some of those moments, and the importance of family and loved ones and support is always a key for me. So my husband, my sister, my daughter, my father. I'm also grateful to have a really close group of girlfriends that some of whom I've known since elementary school, others who I met through college, that are still connected and are all doing very different things around the world, but have maintained that importance of friendship and shared interest in really, we're all human and we all need to respect human rights and the right to, do what we want, but not at the harm or expense of anyone else or whatever you may consider. So I think for me, it's really about respecting that personal courage and taking moments to count our blessings and put ourselves in other people's shoes and look at how we can extend our best and our efforts to continue to make the world a better place.
Nice.
So that quote about be the change you wish to see in the world.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sandi. Is there any last pieces of things that you want to make sure that gets said or anything else, Bob or Sandi?
As soon as we end, I'll think of 4 things.
Yeah, right. Of course. Nice.
And I would say, I think a great way to kind of wrap this interview up, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with everyone today. Theme for our summit in San Diego, the 25th summit, is Transforming Trauma into Triumph.
Nice. Thank you. Wow, fantastic conversation, Raquel. This really brought up a lot of memories for me about all the other summits I've attended over the past 20 years.
What are some of these memories?
Well, some of the first things that come to mind really have to do with the varied speakers and keynotes and presenters who share their experience and their perspectives. It is so rich in all of this content that's brought there. Also, there's this international flavor that's always present at the summit. But also, I'm really excited about being with all of the many people with so many different perspectives and opinions. For so many years, the summit was seen as a big tent where all this thinking and these perspectives are welcomed and accepted. For me, this felt like such a sense of inclusiveness. I know there have been challenges through the years, and yet one of the strengths of the summit is that Bob and now Sandi have done some great things to overcome so many of these challenges.
Dave, it was really great hearing Bob and Sandi's epic moments. And as it turns out, the 25th Annual Summit is its own epic moment. If you would like more information on attending the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma's 25th Annual Summit, please visit www.ivatcenters.org for more information. This has been the Epic Voices and Conversations podcast. If you want to send us feedback or have questions, please email us at evacpodcast@gmail.com. That's evacpodcast@gmail.com. We intend for these podcasts to inspire professionals in a variety of fields, working with people who have experienced trauma or violence, some hope and support to build self-awareness, increase professional self-care strategies, and to help in developing resilience.
We look forward to releasing the next episode in the series of this set of podcasts soon.
For the Epic Voices and Conversations podcast, this is Raquel Buchanan and
Dave Matthews. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you find ways to focus on your own self-care and your own epic moments. Till next time.